As we continue teaching through the proposed doctrinal statement, our ninth statement is on God's purpose of grace. It reads, "We believe that election is the eternal purpose of God, according to which He graciously regenerates, sanctifies, and saves sinners. That being perfectly consistent with the free agency of man, it comprehends all the means in connection with the end. That it is a most glorious display of God's sovereign goodness, being infinitely free, wise, holy, and unchangeable. That it utterly excludes boasting and promotes humility, love, prayer, praise, trust in God, and active imitation of free mercy. That it encourages the use of means in the highest degree, that it may be ascertained by its effects in all who truly believe the gospel. That it is the foundation of Christian assurance, and that to ascertain it with regard to ourselves demands and deserves the utmost diligence." This statement is a statement on God's electing purposes. Election is God's free choosing of men and women to salvation. And it is according to this election, God's electing purposes, that God regenerates, sanctifies, and saves. We cannot separate one of God's works of grace in our lives from the others. Everyone that God elects, He regenerates. He gives life. Everyone that God regenerates, He sanctifies. And everyone He sanctifies, He saves and justifies in the end. As we read through this statement, we see that this statement talks about what election says about God and what election says about us. First, election speaks to God's purposes. And God's electing grace is not conditioned upon anything that He saw in you or me, but solely on His free, happy, sovereign grace. God elects sinners unconditionally to salvation. He elects sinners because of His happy, free choice, not because of what He saw in us. Ephesians 1:9 says that God has made known to us the mystery of His will according to His purpose that He set forth in Christ. God's election is based on God's sovereign purpose. Election also speaks to us about God's wisdom. God did not simply elect sinners. He designs everything necessary for their salvation according to His purpose and plan. As the statement says, that God's election comprehends all the means in connection with the end, which means that in God's sovereign grace, He brings about everything necessary for us to come to know Him and trust in Him. This election also speaks to us about God's goodness. The electing God, the God who would elect sinners because of His own free grace, is a God that must be good. As the statement says, that God's electing grace is a most glorious display of God's sovereign goodness. Think about what this says about God. That He loved you and chose you and set His love on you before you loved Him. He loved you before you loved Him. This is election speaks to us about God's goodness, His purposes, His wisdom. But the statement also emphasizes what God's electing grace and God's electing purposes say about us. If God's election is true, then it must humble us. As 1 Corinthians 1, 27, 29, and 31 says, God chose us, and He chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. If we're going to boast, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, let us boast in the Lord. Because God's electing purposes was on His own free grace and mercy and not what He saw in us, then there is absolutely nothing for us to be proud about if we belong to Him. We can only be thankful for His grace. Second, the statement says that if God's electing purposes are true, we should be zealous for others The statement says that if God's electing grace is true, then it encourages means in the highest degree, which means that God's electing grace does not take away our responsibility to share the gospel, but actually encourages us to share the gospel. It encourages us to tell of the saving news of Jesus to all people because we know for certain that God has elected some for salvation. We can walk into any city, down any street, into any town, go into any country, and say for certain that some will believe because God's electing grace cannot be stopped. It also means that there is no person who can say, I have sinned too greatly, I have gone too far, I have run away from Him too greatly to receive God's love and forgiveness. God would never choose me. God never chooses anyone because they are lovable. God chooses someone and sets His love on them. There's no one too far away from the gospel, because if that was the case, then all of us would have been too far away. God's electing grace encourages us to be zealous for others. And because God's electing grace is the determiner of our salvation, we can know that God will complete the work He started. God's electing grace is the best grounds of our assurance. Maybe one of the most helpful passages in the New Testament about God's electing grace is in Romans 8:28 through 30. Think about what Romans 8:28 says, a verse we all know. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. That is an incredible promise, that no matter what happens to you, no matter what comes into your life, God is working it for your good. And then how does Paul ground that promise? For those whom He foreknew, He predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, in order that He might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom He predestined, He called. And those He called, He justified. And those He justified, He glorified. Why can I be certain that God will complete the good work that He started in me? Why can I be certain that everything that happens to me, everything hard that enters into my life is for my good? Because ultimately my salvation and justification and sanctification and future glorification does not rest on anything in me, any of my own strength or willpower or reserves, but it rests on God and His electing sovereign grace. God's election is the best grounds of your assurance. You know that you are loved because He chose to love you. And finally, if God's electing grace is real, and if God elects us for salvation, then we should labor to know it for ourselves. This is what 2 Peter 1 verse 10 says. He says, therefore, brothers, be all the more diligent to confirm your calling and election, for if you practice these qualities, you will never fail. God's election of us to salvation actually motivates us to greater obedience and greater love and greater diligence because we know He has started a good work in us. We can be confident that He will bring it to completion. We can labor hard for our own sanctification and growth in the gospel, knowing that our labor is not in vain in the Lord. Brothers and sisters, one of the best, most freeing, most joy-producing, most hopeful truths in all of the Bible is that God is a God who loves and chooses sinners who would never choose Him on their own. He loves us, and He has elected us. He has chosen us before the foundation of the world to the praise of His own glory and grace. Glory to our electing sovereign God. Grace and peace.